Who am I and what do I want in life? Those were the first questions I asked myself when I moved here to the state of Texas. After years of devoting my life to church and ministry, both as a pastor and as a volunteer in so many different positions, after living my life in pursuit of God's presence and getting to know the divine, I came back to the intersection of the crossroads where my inner self experienced God and made the decision to believe. And I had to ask myself, did I get lost in the noise of church culture and the chaos of opinionated people along the way? Did I lose sight of who and what I was and my relationship with who and what the divine truly is? Did I pursue God, or did I lose myself in religious ideologies and then called it God? This is my story, and I want to share it with you uncensored and unedited. In 2020, I began a journey of asking questions about God, life, and the Bible, and I began to unlearn toxic teachings and harmful practices that no longer served me and I don't think truly honored God. But there were many events that led up to this pivotal moment in my life. The reformation in my mind did not occur from one day to another. And later on, I came to learn that this was happening with a lot of people, and they were calling it deconstruction. To some, it led to deconvert from the faith, and for others, like myself, it renewed and changed my perspective about faith and about God. But with this change came both internal and external controversy and conflicts. In many ways, I cowered it out to speak up, and in other ways, I didn't. But nonetheless, here I am today, ready to share with you the details of what occurred in my life and give you a glimpse of where I am at today in hopes that my story will perhaps encourage someone or maybe introduce someone to a renewed and different way of approaching God, approaching faith, and of getting to know themselves. I'm not who I used to be, and I'm not who I'm going to be. I'm somewhere in the middle of all of that. And being in the middle can cause extreme discomfort. In the last several years, vulnerability has not been my greatest strength, and for a long time, honesty has not been either. I learned how to be like a chameleon and become everything for everyone in order to fit into their narrative. I was really good at it, and I didn't have to lie, I just didn't have to tell the truth. I learned to suppress me, to filter my life through the lenses of those who were around me. Hardships, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, gossip, and so many other negative experiences, whether personal or witnessed, affected who I was and what I did, what I said, and how I made all of my choices. The more I tried to be everything for everyone, the more exhausted I became, the more I neglected my own mental stability and my own spiritual experience and the relationships that were in my life. These next two episodes are my attempt. They're an attempt at being vulnerable and honest. This is how I get to move forward. Remember that not everything is as it seems. And as I share with you my experiences, you might feel uncomfortable, scared, worried, sad, or you might feel excited, happy, and comforted. Sometimes the people you look up to, the people you love, those you trust, or maybe even yourself might be silent about some parts of your story because we're all still trying to figure out this life and we don't always have the answer to every question that comes our way. And that's okay. Truth be told, we're all a little scared in one way or another. And when we realize that, we will realize how important it is to approach one another with kindness. November 2019, I was in my room praying and pondering about what the next year might bring. During that time of my life, I was a pastor of a church in which I experienced some monumental moments and some pretty bad lows. While I was in my room praying and meditating, I felt this internal gentle whisper say to me, why don't you just learn how to love well? And if I can be honest with you, I got offended and frustrated because up until that point, I felt like I knew how to love well. Why would this be the highlight of 2020? But little did I know that this is where my life would begin to drastically change. This is where my awakening began. December 2019, going into January 2020, I find myself in Puerto Rico officiating my cousin's wedding. The night before I returned back to Florida, I was at this outdoor bar catching up with my uncle, his family, my dad, and his wife. And to give you some context, this is during my pastoral era. So for you to find me anywhere near a bar was completely unheard of. I didn't go to those kind of environments unless I was there to evangelize. While I was there, this conversation sprung up between my dad and I and his wife, and they were sharing with me their experiences with churches and what they believed about God. My dad was never really a religious person. He believed that there must be something out there, but he didn't want to ascribe to any specific religious ideology because he felt that the divine was too big, that God was too big to fit into one singular category. His wife shared with me about her Catholic upbringing and that she still believed in Jesus, but had a lot to question about the people who called themselves his followers, and if I can be honest with you, rightfully so. As we're in this conversation, this question invaded my mind, and I shared it with them. I said, let's imagine for a moment that we're living during Jesus' time on the earth 2,000 years ago. And that instead of being somewhere in the Middle East, Jesus is here in the island of Puerto Rico, roaming around the island. And then I asked them, where do you think that Jesus would be? And my dad wasn't really too sure on what to say, so he let his wife answer first. And she said, well, he would probably be visiting churches and going to the places where he celebrated. And then I looked at my dad, and again, I said, what do you think? And he said, yeah, I agree with what she said. At that point in time, this response just erupted out of me. And I said, no, you're wrong. He would not be in any of those places. If Jesus were here right now in the flesh on this island, he would be sitting right here across from you. And as soon as I said that out loud, I heard this internal gentle whisper say, I am. And every time I think about that moment, I literally get goosebumps and I start to get a little emotional because up until that point in my life, I had been in pursuit of God my whole life, trying to find God in church, in prayer, in fasting, in house groups, in the Bible, and in every place you would consider an obvious space to experience God. And I had amazing experiences growing up in those spaces for sure. But for the first time in a long time, I felt God in such a deep and convicting way. But it was not in any of those places that I was familiar with. It was at a little bar in Puerto Rico, sharing drinks with my dad and his wife. I mean, to me, that was weird. But during that time, I remember that I didn't want to return back to Florida because of the church that I was in and the people that I was dealing with and the situations that I was facing. But that one experience solidified it for me, that no matter what I did, no matter where I went, God was not somewhere out there. God was somewhere in here. And sure, we always believe and preach and talk about that at church, but that was the day that it clicked for me. That was the moment that I became fully aware of that reality. So I boarded the plane and I made my way back to Florida with an experience that I would never forget and never cease from sharing. Although 2020 came with a lot of challenges, and of course it started off with a whole pandemic and everything just went downhill from there. For me, that year was actually a fairly good year. A lot of beautiful memories, new beginnings, and breakthroughs took place in my life. Around the end of February and the beginning of March of that year, I made the decision to step down from pastoring Emerge Church. And that took a lot of people by surprise. But this occurred after I realized that I was in a space where loving well and continuing to grow in that same experience that I felt in Puerto Rico was not going to happen. During that season, I remember witnessing leaders within our church yell at one another across tables, cuss each other out, call one another gross names, accuse one another of lies, and betray one another. I witnessed questionable financial decisions and unethical choices within leadership, and even during church gatherings. Threats were thrown around involving hitmen, leaders calling other pastors suckers, and I heard all kinds of stereotypical, homophobic, and even racist remarks made toward our own church people behind closed doors. Secret meetings were taking place to manipulate decisions that I had made as a pastor, and even a recording came to my attention in which an elder in the church was using foul, ugly language to describe me and tried to turn one of my closest friends against me. Now do you see why I said rightfully so about how my dad's wife felt towards Christian people? It's not an uncommon thing. This is the story that hundreds, if not maybe thousands of people have experienced, and even worse. And some might say, well, there are some bad apples here and there, but to you I say no. The entire orchard is infected with this kind of toxicity, and even if it's just a few bad apples, the Song of Solomon says it's the small foxes that spoil the vine. And in Galatians it says, a little leaven leavens the whole bread. So we can't pretend like a minor isn't still a major issue. During my time at Emerge, I made continual attempts to help rebuild something that was torn down. I poured all that I had in me. I gave it my best shot until I realized that I had overstayed my time and overspent my energy, and it was time to move on. April 26, 2020, Revival Community was born. Revival Co. was the church that we planted with the intention of being a different church in our city. But while Revival Co. was developing, so were many questions about the teachings and the ordinances of the church in general. I began to wonder if many of us lost track of what truly mattered. Along the way, I had a really good friend who helped me sort through some of these questions pertaining to the teachings of the rapture, hell, tithing, and the infallibility of Scripture. I began to ask myself, of the 45,000 denominations that are within Christianity worldwide, what makes our interpretation and our perspective the right one? I began to wonder about the hyper-charismatic and Pentecostal movements that I was a part of, and asked myself how much of that was truly spiritual or emotional or maybe even hypnotic. I thought to myself about those who often like to warn others not to be deceived. Don't be deceived, but oftentimes are the ones who are doing the deceiving. They use this manipulative tactic to control the minds and decisions of other people. And I wondered about my own spiritual experiences growing up and asked myself how much of that was pure, real, and personal, and how much of that was manipulated by other people who were skilled in that area. But the cherry on the top of all of this was when toward the autumn season of that same year, I had a family member who was outed as a lesbian, and that sparked a conversation in our home. I had been hanging out with that same friend I mentioned earlier. We had arrived to my parents' house, and we were sitting at the dining table casually talking when one of my siblings sits at the table and begins to ask me a rather intriguing question. He says to me, if your friend, and he points at my friend who was sitting there, were to come out as gay, would you still be his friend? I said, of course, he would still be my friend. That would not change anything for me. And he shared with me of how he was told that if he were to find out that any of his friends are gay, that he was to abstain from being their friend. My response to that was, how can we claim to be the light and only want to shine in the places where we feel comfortable? How can we claim to love, but only love when it is convenient? You cannot call yourself salt and light if you're not willing to be in the environment where it is the most needed. He said to me, yeah, that's what I thought too. A few hours later, I was in my room with my friend talking about some of those topics that I mentioned earlier, trying to sort through the Bible and use our resources and critical thinking skills to decide, why did we believe the things that we believed in? Was it because someone told us to? And in the middle of that conversation, my mom walks in and asks, did you hear? My siblings shared with me earlier what had occurred. And she shared with me what she told the parents of this family member who was outed. She advised that they should sit and converse with her, share with her what the Bible says, and explain to her why this is wrong. She shared with me what my stepdad said to them as well, and that they should continue to love her, that that is her daughter, and not to treat her any differently. But then she turns to me and she asks me, what do you think? What would you advise them? And I pretty much was ready to agree and say the same thing she said and solidify the same opinion. This is what I was taught growing up, and it's all I've known. But as I was getting ready to open my mouth and express this, I felt yet again that same internal gentle voice, but this time that voice told me to be quiet. So I paused. And I remember looking at my friend, and then I looked at my mom, and I knew that whatever was about to come out of my mouth was not just going to be me speaking. I truly felt and believed that it was God putting words in my mouth. And so I said, let me ask you this question. Of all the real transformations that have ever occurred in your life, did any of them happen because someone sat down with you, read to you a Bible verse, and told you why you were wrong about something? Or did those changes just naturally occur? Did they just happen from the inside out without anyone ever forcing you to change? What changed you? Was it man or was it God? And she said to me, well, it was God. And no one had to do any of those things. And I said, then why are we trying to do this to her? If she's meant to change, God will change her. And if she's not, God won't. Nevertheless, our job isn't to change people. It's not to suppress or to conform people to what we think is correct. Our job is just to love them, period. Bring her into a group of people she can call family, love her in her becoming, accept her where she is at, and allow God to take care of the rest. Her design is not our job. She once again asked, but don't you think she should at least know what the Bible says? And I said to her, why does it matter if she knows what it says if she hasn't even had an experience with God's real love through people? It's not going to even matter. And during that time, I realized that as a church, our biggest problem wasn't convincing people of God. It wasn't even inviting or marketing them into church. Our problem was that we didn't know how to love. 2,000 years after Christ, and here we are still trying to figure out love, the greatest commandment, the whole point of the Jesus story, completely missed and muted by the clashing noise the church had been creating. After that, she walked out, and I looked at my friend, and he looked at me, and he was just like, what was that? And he could feel that the answer I shared was unusual, but very much spirit-led. And so a new topic was added into the conversation, a new question, a new subject was added to our list, which was homosexuality. This is where things really begin to get interesting for me, because I began to wonder, how do I even approach this topic? There's really only ever been one way I've known how, which I will elaborate about in our next episode. But if I could be honest, this was the one subject I approached with the most resistance to change, with the most hesitation. I was expecting not to change my perspective, but to reinforce it. I began to formulate a list of questions in order to guide myself through the research and study more effectively. I already had a predetermined outcome in mind. It was to prove my opinion right. Now, I believe that nothing happens for no reason, and that there are always signs in life that point you in the direction that your story is meant to go in. That began to happen to me from guests that were visiting our church and sharing what they felt God wanted for them to share with us, to people I personally knew in ministry calling me and sharing with me what they felt or dreams that they had been having about where God was going to take me. The signs were coming from every direction, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. One of those signs was a constant reminder that some reformation was coming, or maybe even already among us. Not just in my personal life, though, but also in the lives of our church and maybe even in the world. That a change in our perspective was coming, and that how we did ministry was about to radically change. And it did. After several months of already studying this topic and confirming what I already believed at the time, I still felt like something was missing. For about a month, things went silent for me, and I just kind of stopped my study and just decided that maybe I should just move on from it, or take some sort of break. Still, with a lot of questions that I felt were unasked, therefore unanswered. It wasn't until one day this lady, who at the time I didn't even know, visited our church, and she began to read out of her notebook something that she felt God gave to her the night before to share with us. And throughout that, she began to use specific words and terms pertaining to Reformation that to me were signs leading me to go back to study again, but this time without a predetermined outcome, to see what I might find. I remember the next day grabbing my laptop and a copy of Martin Luther's 95 Theses that led to the Protestant Reformation, wondering what exactly it was that God wanted to reform in my life and the lives of those surrounding me. I sat in front of my laptop and I just stopped for a moment and said this small but significant prayer. Teach me what I don't know, show me what I haven't seen, and give me some sort of clue or keyword of what I should search for. And I remained silent for a moment, and this phrase, the Reformation Project, just dropped into me. And I thought, wow, that's a pretty cool phrase. And being the church planter that I was, I immediately wrote it down thinking, we could use that name for something in the future. But I Googled it, and little did I know what I would find and how much my mindset and my life would change after the information that I found.